Hi, I'm here to talk to you today about the biology and management of three common creeping perennials in lawns and gardens in your area. The three I'm going to talk to you about today include Canada thistle, bishop's goutweed, and creeping bellflower. These are super common in many of our gardens and lawn systems and really are pretty challenging to control. Before I go into the details about talking about the specific biology and management options for these, I do want to point out that we have a lot of resources available to help you with identification and management. If you go to my website listed at the bottom here and look at invasive plant management fact sheets and videos, those are available to help you with identification. Clicking on this invasive ID tab here will get you to some slides that go in detail about the key characteristics for the species and lookalikes as well. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the general concepts to understand when managing perennial weeds, because this will help you as you develop a plan. I came up with 4 key points. Point number 1 is we got to realize that all of these plants and many of the other difficult to control weeds have these below ground perennial structures that store large amounts of energy in the soil. They can often be upwards of 80 to 90% of the overall biomass is stored below ground, and this makes them really difficult to manage. They can survive and recover from many management options as a result of this. So this is a real challenge. The second issue we have to realize, while our management is going to focus on the perennial parts, they also can produce seed, and those can be a problem in reinvading an area. A lot of the areas that you're trying to get under control have been infested for a large amount of time. And the third key point to remember is if it's been infested for a large amount of time, there's lots of these resources below ground in perennial structures usually, and lots of seeds in the seed bank. So those are both going to make it a challenge to manage. And while we always emphasize talking about approach X versus Y, often when we integrate these approaches together is when we see the best results. And so I want to just remind you of that up front. Okay, let's jump into it and talk about Canada thistle, Cirsium arvense. It's a creeping perennial, has creeping perennial roots. This is what the leaves look like. They'll have this lobing on the leaves. This lobing can be quite variable depending on the species, the variety or cultivar and the time of year, but all of the tips of the lobes will have one small yellow spine. However, if you look on the stem does not have spines and it's round. A lot of times the leaves wrap over them, so you have to look closely to see that, but that's a good characteristic. It flowers and has pink to purple flowers, and looking in the spring or the fall, you'll just see a rosette, which is just a bunch of leaves with no visible stem. This plant emerges in late April in most parts of the state into early May, flowering at the end of June to early July. Again, most of the year it can be vegetative with those rosettes. If you disturb those plants and mow them or remove them, a lot of times in the fall you'll see those rosettes as well. And really, when dealing with this, it's this extensive root system that's really challenging. This picture depicts a situation where they planted one small perennial root around the size of a pencil, came back a year later, and this is how much root production occurred. So large amounts. It's been documented that these roots can grow laterally over 15 feet, and in some instances go up to 15 feet deep in the soil, depending on the soil type. So very large areas that they're accumulating in. This is a sun-loving plant, so we only see this in full sun. While we do recommend mulching in most cases, the fabric mulches and tarping is not very effective as a standalone treatment, and many of the tarps can be pushed up by these stems that we do see. The good news is almost all the seed is dead within 3 to 6 years of being created. In just a few cases, we can get seed lasting a long period, but that's a very small component. As I said before, management is going to focus on controlling those perennial roots. We have non-chemical and chemical approaches. I'm going to first talk about those non-chemical approaches here, and then we'll get into the chemical approaches. And I think especially with Canada thistle, having a vigorously growing plants that compete well is really critical in your management plan. Mulching will not solve the problem. Small amounts of mulch, as you can see here, these plants just blow through. But if we can get 1 to 2 or even more inches of mulch present, that can really help. It'll stress that plant out as it has to grow through that mulch and help with the hand removal, because when you have that large amounts of mulch and you do hand removal, you can remove more of that perennial root structure, and that'll help you in the long term. There are several biocontrol insects and diseases that impact Canada thistle. I'm not going to talk about those because they don't really fit in well with a homeowner lawn setting, and they don't work very well or consistently. So they're really not a very good control technique that we often recommend. We are going to talk about some chemical approaches. The good news is there are some chemicals that are really effective and can give you almost 100% control for over a year if you can apply these. The bad news is few of them are registered for use in lawns or in the home, and there's lots of restrictions on the ones that are. The key thing I want to mention here is timing is key to be successful for management. If we're going to do some above ground disturbance, such as mowing or probably more likely hand removal of those plants, ideally want to wait until that stem is being produced and that plant is bolting. Because what happens there is we get a lot of energy being used to create that stem. And so if we wait to then that time frame, we're depleting it before it gets a chance to recover that energy. And then after that time frame, every 3 to 4 weeks, you see a bunch of new leaves show up. You want to repeat that process. It's going to take multiple years of repeating this to eliminate populations, likely 3 to 4 to 5. But you'll see a rapid decline if you can stick with this for a year, and that density will be a lot less. If you want to use herbicides, we recommend spraying with a systemic herbicide that can move into the roots. And there's 2 key timings when we want to apply: at the flower bud stage, right before the plants flower, and in the fall in those rosettes, anytime from September, October, and in some cases, we can even apply up to November and get really effective control. What herbicides do we recommend? I'm going to separate this out to in turf and not in turf. In turf settings, we're going to rely solely on post-emergent herbicides that we're going to spray onto the leaves of plants. We don't have anything that works really, really well that's registered. So expect partial control, 3 months, maybe more, and having to reapply or conduct other management in future years. And several of these products fit well into this. I would look for one that has an active ingredient called triclopyr is probably our best bet. And don't expect great control, expect modest control at best. In non-turf areas, there are more options available. And again, we're going to focus on those post-emergent applications. But we want to make sure that we're only applying and directing that herbicide to where those leaves and stems are. And we really want to minimize any herbicide that does not hit the leaves or the stems. So there's lots of restrictions on these different herbicides. We need to make sure that the product we're applying is registered for use where you intend to use it. And we need to think about how we're applying it so we don't get drift onto other plants. And some of these products will persist in the soil, and then we can actually get uptake from the soil. So we really want to minimize that application of that herbicide to the soil surface. And so here's a great example, this product called Launtrol. Active ingredient in this is clopyralid. It's actually registered for use in turf, but only non-residential turf, and we'll talk about why that's the case in the next slide. But it actually can be applied to the flower beds, but only in a spot treatment approach. They do have some information on which types of species you can apply this in beds. There's a list of plants that are safe, such as conifers, ornamental grasses, and several ground covers. But many of the brush species and trees are sensitive to this product, is why we rarely recommend this for use in a homeowner type situation. And you can refer to the label for some of the specifics. There's lots of warnings, lots of potential for injury, so I rarely recommend this in a homeowner setting. Well, you maybe were thinking, well, why can't we use this in turf? What's the deal? Well, this herbicide persists in the soil for months to years, and it also persists in the plant material that it's sprayed onto for months and even up to a year. And so why does this matter in a residential area? Well, what do we do with grass clippings? Well, a lot of times we mulch them back into the soil itself, or we collect them and put them in a compost pile, or we may give them to a facility to actually compost. Well, what we found is when we do that, this active ingredient clopyralid can persist through that composting product, and the result of that compost, when we put it back into the environment, will have low levels of clopyralid still present. And even though it's low levels, it's enough to cause injury to many sensitive plants in the bean family or legume family, as well as the sunflower family and the solanaceous family or tomato group. And so we've often seen injury from this. It's been well documented, and we're really trying to eliminate this. We've done research and we found that rates as low as 100 parts per billion, that's like taking a grain of salt and putting it in a swimming pool, can cause injury to tomatoes. So this is the reason why we're trying to keep it out of residential environments. Okay, going on to the next species, creeping bellflower. This is another creeping perennial. It has alternate leaves with elongated heart-shaped type leaves, and the stems a lot of times tend to be purple. Again, the stems are round, no hairs, around 1 to 3 feet tall in most cases, but can get taller, and has these beautiful pink to purple flowers. We planted this because it has these beautiful flowers, but it has definitely taken over many of our flower beds and other systems and is a pain in the butt. These leaves will persist in the spring and the fall as rosettes, as you'll see in some of the subsequent pictures. This one emerges in early April, flowers in the end of June to July. In shaded areas, I've seen it flowering well into August as well. And it does have a vegetative as well as a flowering stage in the spring and the fall. The big difference with Canada thistle in this species is it does have an extensive creeping root system, but it's not as prolific. It extends laterally around a foot and in depth around a foot to a little bit more. So it allows for some excavation to be more successful than what's really realistically impossible with Canada thistle. This is a sun and a shade loving plant, so we can see it in both scenarios. And it also tolerates mulch and or tarping, but it's more sensitive. The stems aren't as thick and are less likely to push up some fabric mulches. Couldn't find a lot of information on seed longevity. What little information I found sounds like it can persist for maybe up to 3 years. So what is our management? Should also focus on attacking these perennial roots. As you can see here, they can get quite large in some cases. So what do we want to do? Non-chemical approaches include vigorous growing plants that compete well. I think this works really well with lots of mulch, and that's how I've been working it in my backyard, and integrating that mulch with lots of hand pulling or hand removal. Again, if you have multiple inches of mulch, it has to grow through that mulch in order for you to remove it. And you're doing a lot of damage, but you need to repeat that approach for multiple years and multiple times within the year. There are several chemicals that are effective. There are some that are more effective than others, but the few are registered for homeowner use as well. So I want to emphasize this point because many of you may be saying, I've been hand pulling it and it just isn't working at all. And this is the problem with this as a unique plant, is often when we hand pull it, we just get this top layer here and it breaks off right here. And you may be thinking, oh, I'm getting this part of the root and there's not a lot left. I'm getting 99% of the root. Well, this plant has a unique structure, as you can see here, where it creates a very small perennial root, but that goes down an inch or two, sometimes 3 inches, and then it attaches to this bigger perennial root. So if we're not careful, many times we're collecting this part of the root, but we're missing this larger storage of energy. And this is why hand removal alone isn't effective. Adding a lot of mulch will help stress this and use much more energy for this plant. Like Canada thistle, the timing is the key for management. We want to wait as well for that plant is bolting or producing a stem to conduct removal. You'll see there'll be much less stored energy below ground, and we'll get more. That plant will resprout, and then those summer months and into the fall is where we need to every 3 to 4 weeks keep that up. That's where adding that mulch can really help. Herbicide applications less studied than Canada thistle, but we still think, again, the flower bud stage or in the fall are, again, the 2 best timings for application. As far as herbicides recommended for turf, we really want to rely on products that are post-emergent, and probably the fall is the best time to look at that. Looking at products that contain dicamba are the ones that I would recommend. You can get excellent control. In non-turf areas, there are some more options. Again, we want to focus on a spot treatment method and really use judicial amounts. Clopyralid is the most effective herbicide we know, but there's lots of restrictions on its use, as I mentioned, in flower beds and other areas. I would never use it in a garden setting. So be aware of that issue. Make sure when you're applying these products, they're registered for use in that area, and be careful to limit that overspray. and be aware of residual activity. One of the reasons why I would not recommend clopyralid in most situations. Okay, moving on to the last one, Bishop's goutweed. This has many other names. Agapodium podagraria is the scientific name. Another creeping perennial. Its leaves are quite a bit different. It's in the carrot family. It has alternate compound leaves. The leaves can be variegated. In most cases, they're not. And it has this white umbrella-shaped flower, as you'll see in many of these pictures. It emerges in April as well, flowering anywhere from end of May all the way through July, and has these beautiful white flowers. That's why it's planted in a lot of sides of garages and other flower beds in other areas. It is vegetative for much of the spring and can become vegetative again in the fall. Creeping roots are extensive, but they are not as extensive as Canada thistle, 12, maybe 24 inches that they can spread laterally and deep as well too. More prolific than creeping bellflower, not as much as Canada thistle. And again, this will survive well in sun as well as shade. Is effective in mulch and tarping. It will grow through this, so can't utilize these alone unless you have a very hard tarp that's set there and you're planning on leaving it in place for months to years. Seed longevity, couldn't find a lot of information on this one. It suggests that it's around 3 years as well. So really, with management, we're focusing on controlling those perennial roots. And they can do some pretty intensive, can establish across pretty intensive areas, as you can see here. So really, our approaches are the same. As we've talked about with these other two species, we want to try and get some vigorously growing plants there that can compete in full sun. That's easy. We have lots of options. Grasses are probably what we would look for because we have selective herbicides we can apply to this over the top to those and continue to mow in combination with mowing. Mulch is effective. It will outgrow it, but it will give you some opportunities to integrate with hand pulling or doing some removal as well. This plant you can remove by digging up the soil, but it is more difficult than creeping bellflower. I have had some limited success. As far as chemicals go and herbicides, several herbicides are somewhat effective. This has not been well studied, so we don't really have good detailed information on this. We just have some anecdotal information we've heard from practitioners. And again, timing is the key. Like anything else, if we're going to do some type of removal, we want to try and do it when it's producing a stem, but before it flowers, so minimal stored energy below, maximizing the damage, and we need to keep on repeating this. And this is probably where, if you can get productive grasses growing in full sun, you can, with taking care of the grasses and managing them well and repeated mowings, effectively eradicate it. We've heard stories of individuals doing that. Otherwise, we're relegated to spraying herbicides, systemic herbicides that move into there. Again, no data, but we're looking at flower bud to flowering stages probably are effective. We can probably spray it a little later and into the fall. The key is we don't want to spray it first thing in the spring. We want to try and wait so we get better translocation. As far as turf goes, in full sun, when it's invading turf settings, we want to do things to promote healthy turf, fertilize, mow high, all the things that our turf specialists talk about, and want to rely on products that contain dicamba and or triclopyr are probably our best bets. In non-turf scenarios, we want to focus on removing the perennial parts if we can. Tarping or mulch can be options. If we're tarping, we're going to need to do it for 5 months to a year, so long periods to get some level of control. And follow up with hand pulling or spot treatment. Clopyralid might work. We've heard good news about triclopyr, which I didn't put in here as well. Dicamba and glyphosate are our options. So I know we've gone through 3 difficult to control species. Some summary comments that I would have is realize when you're getting into this, it's hard. Creeping perennial weeds are difficult to control. So try and utilize multiple approaches to management. Plan on multiple years. Don't think you're going to get rid of this in 1 year. Be intensive in the first year to 2, and you'll likely have less energy, less effort needed in subsequent years if you really get after it. And really the key is to integrate plants, if possible, into that management will give you the best results. Just relying on mulch and not a lot of other competitive plants a lot of times leads to failures. We need to pick plants that can compete with the weeds that we're trying to get rid of. So in many cases, those are perennial grasses, do a really good job. We need to pick plants also that are well adapted to the environments that we're doing. So if it's full sun, a lot of full sun grasses can do that. Shaded areas, that can often really be challenging. We don't have a lot of competitive plants. And this is the one point that often we don't think about, is we need to think about plants that can tolerate our management activities that we have planned. If it's an area where we're planning on mowing it repeatedly, we need to take into consideration that we pick plants that can survive and tolerate mowing. If it's a scenario where we're going to rely on mulching, we need to pick plants that do well in a mulch environment, etc. So those are some tips on controlling some of these. Hopefully you can have some success in future endeavors, and then that'll allow you to get out and enjoy the beautiful landscape of Wisconsin. Thanks for your time and energy, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.